Hello. Welcome to tonight's bedtime story by Lucid Tales. I hope your day has been warm and loving, but whether it has been a joyous day or a mournful one, it's time to relax now. Find somewhere comfortable, maybe your bed or a favourite armchair, and make sure you're ready for sleep. Take a few deep, slow breaths if you can, and feel the freedom in your chest, the little loosening that means it's time for bed. Tonight's story is Hansel and Gretel, collected by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a woodcutter who lived deep in the dark, deep forests of Germany, where the air smells of green pine and where all manner of strange creatures dwell. He lived there with only his two small children, for his wife had died and left them alone. In time, the woodcutter remarried to a fine woman with a strong back and kind heart. But as the years went by, as years do, times grew hard, and for a long time there was not enough to eat. The children's stepmother tried her best to make ends meet, but she soon became tired and sad, her face drawn with hunger and her limbs like sticks. She and the woodcutter often skipped meals to let the children eat, but in time this grew impossible, for they must eat to work and must work to bring in more food. At last, one night while the children were in bed, the woman turned to her husband and said, "We do not have enough to eat. Not for all four of us. I cannot watch the children starve any more, or you. If we continue to go hungry, we will die, and our children will die too, for we will not be there to take care of them. But if we take the children into the forest, they may be found by someone better able to care for them than we are, and we ourselves may live too." The woodcutter was sore of heart, and did not want to abandon his beautiful children all alone in the dark, deep forest. But there did not seem to be another way out. There was nowhere and no one that he knew who could feed two more children, and many had lost loved ones already. And he also knew that his wife was right. If the two of them died, the children would die too without them. But little did he know that his two young children were stood listening behind the door, and had heard every word that was said, and knew that their parents planned to leave them out there alone, in the dark, deep forest. "Don't worry, Hansel," said Gretel. "We can gather the white stones from the path around the house and take them with us." Hansel did not understand why, but he agreed, and early the next morning they awoke and filled their pockets with the small white pebbles. The woodcutter and his wife led the two children far from the house, into the dark, deep forest, saying they must search for mushrooms to eat. After a time, they told the two children to stay where they were and wait for them to come back, and they left them there alone, in the dark, deep forest. But Hansel and Gretel had scattered the white pebbles behind them as they went, and when their parents did not return, they were able to follow them by the light of the moon all the way back home. The woodcutter and his wife wept with joy and grief when their children returned to them, and held them tightly. But nonetheless, when the next day dawned, they led them once again far away from the house in search of mushrooms. But this time, poor Hansel and Gretel had not managed to fill their pockets with the small white pebbles, for their stepmother had woken them and ushered them out of the house before they could think. And all they had to mark their way was the crumbling crust of bread Hansel held in his hand. But still they scattered the crumbs as they went, hoping that they might lead them home. Once again, when their parents left them there alone in the dark, deep forest and did not return, the two children turned to follow the trail of breadcrumbs back home. But alas and alack, the hungry birds had swooped down upon them and gobbled them up. And the children, frightened and lost, were alone in that dark, deep forest. They wandered through the trees, hoping that they might find some familiar place, but they were far from home, and it was getting dark. They spent a cold and miserable night curled inside a hollow tree, and when the morning light came they had not slept a wink. They were cold and tired and hungry, but they had no more tears to shed, and so onward they trudged. As evening fell once again over the boundless forest, the children began to slow, weary and half sick with fear of the wolves and bears that might lurk amongst the trees. But then, far away, and shrouded by the trees and brush, Hansel saw a light. With a cry of joy, the pair ran through the woods, heedless of the brambles that snatched at their ankles, the branches that reached for them, warning them back. There, up ahead in a little hollow, stood a strange house. It looked to be made entirely of gingerbread, set behind a candy cane fence. Its gate was marked with lollipops. The path up to the front door was set with shiny-coloured chocolate pebbles. Icing covered its snowy roof, and warm light glowed from its sugar-pane windows. The two children let themselves in at the lollipop gate and stepped lightly over the chocolate pebble path, and when they reached the gingerbread house they each took great handfuls of it to eat, they were so hungry. In but a short time, the sound of their tearing and munching woke the witch that lived inside the gingerbread house. And when she looked out of her sugar-pane window she was mightily angry, for the witch did not hoard so much beautiful food to be shared, neither for its beauty or flavour, but merely for the having of it. But the witch was wily, and she put on honeyed tones and opened the little toffee door with its black licorice handle, and welcomed the two hungry, cold children inside. She fed them a delicious meal of rich stew, followed by all the desserts they could eat, and tucked them up warmly in two little beds. But the next morning she was not so kindly. At the crack of dawn the witch woke Hansel by bodily lifting him from his bed and tossing him into a cage attached to a chain on a pulley, and she hoisted him high into the sweet-smelling rafters. Gretel, woken by her brother's shouts, clung to the witch's knees and begged her to let her brother go. But the witch sneered and pressed a broom into Gretel's hand. "If you want your brother free, you'll have to work for it, dearie." And so Gretel went to work, sweeping crumbs and baking new shingles and cleaning every last corner of the witch's gingerbread house, for the witch did not like to work, and in an age before glasses she could not see well, and in all ways she preferred to have her little servant girl take care of it. But no matter how hard she worked, whenever she asked the witch if Hansel could be freed, the witch only laughed and said, "Not yet, dearie." Gretel began to notice things, like the way the witch would feed her as little as possible, and yet pile Hansel's plate so high he could barely finish them. She would fly into a rage if he did not, and so he ate every last scrap. Once a day the witch would demand to feel Hansel's finger poked out from the bars of the cage and mumble to herself that he was still too skinny. In time, Gretel realized with horror that the witch was fattening her brother up to eat him, and hoped that he knew too, for she had no way to speak to him. But Hansel too was a clever child, and on the floor of his cage he had found an old, thin bone, and whenever the witch demanded to feel his finger to see how fat he was getting, he presented the bone instead. But the witch, convinced she was as famished as any in the land, at last could wait no longer, and impatiently ordered Gretel to stoke up the stove. Gretel, filled with dread, did as she was ordered, and piled up wood high inside the great iron stove. "Check if it's hot enough," demanded the witch, with a nasty glint in her eye. "How should I do that?" Gretel asked. "Put your head in it, you foolish girl," snapped the witch. But I don't know how hot you would like it, Gretel said desperately, for she knew that the witch would lock her in the stove as she could. Oh, for goodness sake, snapped the witch, and kneeled down to stick her head in through the huge door. As soon as she had, Gretel gave the witch an almighty push and slammed the furnace door shut behind her. The witch's shrieks disappeared up the chimney with the smoke and howled out into the world. Sometimes, when the wind is high, you can still hear her voice crying out among the tall trees of that dark, deep forest. Gretel rushed to release Hansel from his cage, setting him down with quite a bump. Before they left the gingerbread house, they explored every nook and cranny, searching for anything that might be of use to them. The idea of staying did not occur to them, of course. Who would want to live in a house made of cake when the magic that held it together was gone and the rains came and made it all soggy? After a time they discovered the cellar, deep in the rich brown earth, and found the witch's great chests of treasure, gems and gold and crystal, that she had hoarded not for the joy of them, the beauty of fine things, or to share with her neighbours, but for the having of them. The two children filled their pockets with as much as they could carry, and took knapsacks full of treasure too. At last they locked up the house and walked away, weighed down by gold and as much gingerbread as they could stomach, knowing that even with their new wealth it might be many days before they found food. But luck and glory, as they walked alone through the dark, deep forest, up ahead they saw a familiar glade, and a brook whose babbling they knew well. In delight they walked faster, until up ahead, between the trees, they saw at last their own home, its windows dark for want of candles. But here the girl and the boy hesitated. Who knew what welcome they would find in that dark, warm house? Would they be taken away, out into the woods again? Would their parents be happy to see them, dead from hunger? At last, Gretel took Hansel's hand and said, "Let's go in, Hansel." And they crept forward, their pockets and bags full of treasure clinking quietly in the moonlight. At last they stopped in front of the door and knocked. The door, of course, flew open, and there stood the woodcutter, haggard and thin. With one look at his children, he burst into tears and gathered them in his arms. Inside, their stepmother lay languishing on the bed, even thinner than their father, but since they had left, she had pined away and secretly skipped meals so that her husband might be able to work at his hard labour felling trees and that he might live. All was forgiven, and the very next day the woodcutter went into town and brought back so much food that they could feast for a week. In time, all four grew healthy and hearty again, and lived happily once more as a family. "Your treasure from the witch has made us rich," said the stepmother. "But you two will always be our real treasure, and we will never let you go again." I suppose we all make bad decisions when we're hungry, don't we? Good night. Sleep well, and I will see you tomorrow for another bedtime story.